is one of my books, The Mermaid's Tale. I do a bunch of read books. Bear Cavalry, which is an alternate history novel about bear cavalry. No Horse in Dark Places, What Devours, Also Hungers, Dawn of Cthulhu, Giant Monsters Sing Sad Songs, Fall of Atlantis, Greatest Unauthorized Doctor Stories, 2 volumes, a few things here and there. All right. So I've been writing for about 20 years or so, and I've had short stories published in a bunch of different places. I've written a bunch of novels. So what I'm going to do to start off with, since I've got 15 minutes to kill, is do a recent story. Ever heard of Godzilla? I'm pretty sure you have. Okay, so this is a kaiju story. I did this last year. It's unpublished, but it's coming up in the collection. And it's called Kaiju Orgy. The giant monster Valdron roared, the sheer kinetic energy of the sound waves shattering windows and nearby skyscrapers. Junichiro Takahashi, captain of the Science Rescue Force, swore as he wrestled with the hopper, darting in and out between buildings, catching glimpses of the immense saurian. "We have visual," the lovely Lieutenant Tamiki Sakano yelled, activating the recording device. The creature loosed an incandescent stream of flaming plasma, slicing through an office tower. As the building began to collapse, Takahashi pulled the chopper up, searching for a suitable rooftop. Then he felt it, the tremor in his soul, the flutter of an alien presence. An iridescent beam of shimmering light shot down from the sky into an open plaza, barely a quarter mile from the rampaging Valdron. Where it touched down, the ball of light settled, lightning arced all around, and as the light faded, an unearthly giant stood in its place. Tall among the office buildings, it stepped forward, its slender limbs full of unearthly grace. The silver giant had arrived. "We're saved," Tamiki cried out. "The silver giant will stop the monster." Valdron roared at its enemy as the silver giant eased into a combat stance, the titans preparing to do battle. Takahashi surveyed the buildings, looking for a stable location to set down. The silver giant was flung back, its purple ray blasting harmlessly into the sky. The momentum from the giant saurian, Valdron's blow, sending it spinning around, crashing through buildings until it found itself on hands and knees. "Get up," Takahashi whispered. "Get up, get up." He and Tamiki Sakano were designated monitors for Science Rescue Force, keeping tabs on the monsters, even as operational members of the force engaged in evacuation and rescue. Takahashi was the spotter, piloting the hopper and guiding the craft to secure locations, while Sakano operated the recording equipment. They'd worked well together through many kaiju incursions. But despite their friendship, Takahashi kept 2 secrets from her. The first was his unspoken, romantic, but somehow chaste love for his colleague. The second was his psychic link to the silver giant, the alien presence always in the back of his mind. He would have been hard-pressed to say which one was more vital to him. Valdron was closing in fast behind the silver giant, its lumbering bipedal stride almost comical, were it not for the massive trail of destruction behind it. The blue and green dragon's dorsal spikes were already glowing, lightning arched around its eyes. But the silver giant was barely moving. Was it stunned? Painfully, its palms flat on the ground, it tried to get its feet under it, elevating its hips, and remained there as if waiting. Smoke was trickling from Valdron's jaws. The behemoth seemed to pick up speed like a colossal walking freight train, bearing down on the silver giant from behind. "Get up," Takahashi screamed. "He's right on top of you." And then, suddenly, shockingly, they collided, with a sound like thunder cracking out. Valdron clamped its paws to the side of the silver giant's hips, and in turn, the giant arched its back. The first crack of thunder was followed by another, and then another, as it settled into a series of rhythmic booms. In the seconds that followed, a horrified Takahashi knew he had only one choice. He placed his hands over Tamika's eyes. "You shouldn't see this," he said, horrified. But instead, she pushed his hands away. "Dolt, I'm not a little girl," she said. "I grew up on a farm. Now let me do my job, you whiny custard brain." In front of them, the rhythmic booming continued, the ultrasonic shock waves making their diaphragms vibrate. But Takahashi was having a hard time focusing. His mind was being overwhelmed with feedback from his silver giant. images and sensations crashing through him. "Oh my," he whispered, and then passed out. Later on, the science rescue force had assembled in the auditorium. Takahashi looked around. Practically the entirety of the base was there, field operatives, even mechanics and support personnel. He nodded to Tamiki. She glanced at him and looked away uncomfortable. Hurriedly, she plucked a wet nap from her valise and wiped her hands. Things had been awkward between them ever since the incident. After he passed out, she tried to render first aid, and he'd stained his pants. Over a dozen times, actually. He'd had no idea that a human body could contain that much fluid. Apparently, it had surprised Tamiki as well. She'd been obsessively washing her hands ever since. The director came forth. "I am Shigeru Onodera," he said, "and when I was a very young boy playing with my friends on the shores of Tokyo Bay, I witnessed the rising of the first kaiju, Ogazar. To this day, I still don't know what made me stop and look out over the bay. Perhaps it was a flight of birds taking off from the water, perhaps a stream swelling on the surface. But I was watching, and I believed that I was the first to see that monstrous head, those horns, those glowing eyes come out of the sea as it headed to Tokyo in 1954. I was perhaps 5 years old then, and I knew I was looking at something terrible. And I knew that there would be great suffering. I could do nothing but watch. I promised then that I would spend the rest of my life trying to save humanity from this monster and the ones that followed. I have done my best to keep that promise." He seemed deflated. Now it seems that the recent work of Tomiko Sakano has given us all much to think about. Then the lead scientist, Fumiko Otto, stepped forward, her lab coat of blazing white. She tapped the microphone. Ahem, is this on?" She gazed out over the assembled throng. "I'm sure you've heard all the reports and rumors of the Gorgoron encounter. Some of you are undoubtedly eyewitnesses, and we have Ms. Sakano's recording, but before we review it, I want to revisit some of our data. We're all aware that the age of kaiju began in 1954 with King Ogazar, the radioactive dinosaur tyrant. It devastated Tokyo, then under attack from defense forces returned to die in the sea. Well, as it turns out, every assumption was wrong. It was not a dinosaur. It was not the creation of atomic testing or radiation, and it did not die. Instead, it reappeared, as did more and more of its kind, dozens of them, creatures of enormous impossible size and destructive abilities, many of which featured reptilian or arthropod traits or combinations of these qualities. At first, these creatures were attributed to many sources: chemical spills, atomic testing, radiation leaks, mad scientists, even secret government projects. But eventually, analysis of isotope residues demonstrated they were not of this Earth. All of these monsters were from outer space. In 1967, the first of the silver giants appeared on Earth, fighting the kaiju. Since then, there have been several silver giants, and while they do not always appear during kaiju outbreaks, whenever they have, they've battled kaiju, saving tens of thousands of lives, preventing immense property damage. It is not an exaggeration to say that the silver giants have saved human civilization. We believed that they'd come to save us from alien menace. We were wrong, she announced. Play the recording. The lights dimmed, the giant screen behind Dr. Otto lit up. Calmly, she walked to the edge of the stage. The silver giant appeared, 50 meters tall, thousands of tons of weight, an almost slender humanoid figure with a flat face and glowing insect eyes appeared. Silver body, almost metallic, iridescent with purple, red, and green highlights. The giant flashed through a series of poses as stock footage played, displaying its anatomy. Somehow the footage conveyed a sense of a creature as much insect-like as humanoid, something whose resemblance to men and women was as coincidental as it was startling. Next flashed Gorgoron, one of the most terrifying of the giant monsters. Over 70 meters tall, festooned with spikes, horns, protrusions, all sprouting from a reptilian dinosaur-like frame. Triple-jointed jaws opened as it roared, and luminescent stripes glowed. It released a stream of fire from its mouth. Takahashi knew it was coming next, and he sank down into a seat. Sakano automatically pulled another wipe from her valise to wash her hands. The two titanic beams appeared together in Sakano's reporting. The silver giant clearly on all fours, hips elevated, waiting as the monster bore down on it. It was the wait, those long seconds of hesitation as the giant reptile approached, that made it awful. Takashi had always remained pure. He'd avoided pornography. But even in his own personal innocence, there was no denying what that position signified. A moment later, Gorgoron had borne down, the rhythmic booming had begun, as well as other sounds that might have been moaning or roaring. Takahashi couldn't bear to watch. He looked away. Also, he'd stained his pants again. The screen went dark, and Dr. Otto once again strode to the podium. "We're having sex," she said bluntly. "That's what it's been this whole time, sex." Behind her, the screen lit up, showing frames from previous recent battles between kaiju monsters and their enemies, the silver giants. Each captured pose was somehow more licentious and provocative than the last. Takahashi knew these were life and death battles, but these frozen images suggested other interpretations. In hindsight, she said, "We should have figured this all out long ago. The kaiju and the silver giants, they're the same species. This has become clear as we re-examine the isotope traces. Same species, same origins, just different genders. Like the birds of our world, the male gender has become large and colorful to attract the notice of potential mates. They've become tall, they've grown elaborate horns, feathers, spikes, scales, plumage to display and attract attention, while the opposite female gender is plain and smooth. This posturing gender does not just develop plumage. It demonstrates itself among birds, it builds nests and constructs elaborate songs. Among kaiju, it engages in wanton destruction to show its power and might, to prove its sexual worth. For the last 4 decades, we have not been witnessing battles between good and evil races of giant aliens. We've been watching courtships, elaborate mating dances as the females select among their suitors. Tens of thousands of people have died so they can get jiggy." From the audience, a ripple of protest emerged. "Why'd they come here?" someone protested. "We don't know," Dr. Otto said. Maybe our cities and landscapes are simply delightful to destroy. The buildings crash and fall apart satisfyingly. I mean, I can't imagine kicking around rocks on barren worlds is much fun. It could be it's as simple as that." Otto hesitated. "Or perhaps it's the fact that humans resemble tiny versions of their female's base form. Maybe that inspires them. Maybe they're just kinky. It would be like humans having sex in the middle of a complex of termite mounds filled with Barbie dolls. I mean, who knows? The point is that our planet is now hostage to giant alien sex rituals." Takahashi felt suddenly so unclean. He reached back along the psychic link he'd had with the silver giant. Was it really that? Not good versus evil, not heroism, not paragons of light saving a fragile humanity from the outer darkness? Could it really be so tawdry and vulgar? For a moment, the link opened, and he had a sense of what the silver giant was doing right at this moment. He broke the link, but even that glimpse had been too much. His body was shaking, his skin felt clammy and sweaty, and he's distressed to notice he'd stained his pants again. He carefully picked up his file folder and laid it across his hips, hoping no one would notice. "It's clear," Dr. Otto said. "This interpretation suggests we're on the verge of a new pattern of behavior, one which will have major impacts on the pornography industry, public morality, and perhaps even pose vast challenges to explaining to our children." Takahashi didn't want to hear another word. He wanted to shrivel up. He'd always believed he was special, that his contact, his psychic link to the silver giant, was a touch of something divine, that he'd been enlisted in a noble, righteous purpose. Now it turned out he was just a puppet of space perverts. He noticed Tamiki talking to a few other women. She pointed at him, and they all looked in his direction. Takahashi blushed deeply and pretended to look away. He tried to concentrate on blocking out the silver giant's psychic connection. The feelings were bad enough, but once in a while he got an image of monstrous anatomy slipping through, and he really didn't want that in his head. "So," someone was saying, "our world is just a cheap love hotel for alien monsters. What do we do? How do we deal with this?" Director Shigeru Onodera stood resolute. "As disturbing as this knowledge is, it changes nothing. We must continue as we have been, evacuating, rescuing, rebuilding, saving who we can and fighting. The only shame is surrender." He paused. "This awful knowledge offers us hope. We know their motives and motivations now, and we can only hope that once they've all got it out of their system, they'll go home, depart our world, and leave us in peace." The assembled members of the Science Rescue Force rose for a standing ovation as Onodera bowed his head in acknowledgement. all except Takahashi, whose pants were in far too awkward a state to permit him to stand. Instead, he sat damp and miserable. Surely there was more to it than kinky alien sex, he thought desperately. Although from the images and sensations coming in, it was definitely kinky. But sex involved reproduction. He could only hope that wherever they laid their eggs, settled their lava, or birthed their young, wherever those things were, they'd do it far away. As Onodera had hoped, both the silver giants and the kaiju monsters faded away, their courtships climaxing again and again in unnatural acts. Sated, both genders drifted away from Earth, leaving nothing but ruins and destruction behind. Mankind breathed a sigh of relief, and life seemed to return to normal. But deep, deep beneath the Earth, in hidden chambers scattered across the planet, pulsing golden eggs glowed with lambent light. Suddenly, in one chamber, the surface of one of the eggs rippled. A claw-like hand struck through, surging up. More eggs rippled. Slowly, beings began to struggle out, human-sized and human-shaped, but with their bodies smooth, resembling the shapes of the silver giants. Their heads somewhat oversized, some of them bearing insect-like antennae and plates. One by one, they struggled and stumbled, gazing out at each other in wonder. Unconsciously, they picked up the telepathic emanations from the emu world above, temporarily reshaping themselves as young men and women. One by one, they began to stumble out into the world above. Out in space, proud fathers began to hear the squalls of their newborns on faraway Earth, that world of tiny beings whose edifices and activities invited such delightful destruction. Newborns who would mimic the local species, who would slowly come into their powers, reverting to natural forms. Some of them lone riders, others clustering around together as groups of powered rangers and sentai. The newborns would have to be taught, to be cultivated, to be challenged, so that they could fully develop their abilities and mature. The proud fathers began the long journey back to Earth. Things were about to get interesting on that planet, like loving parents everywhere. They didn't want to miss a minute of it. Okay, thank you. That story was inspired by Godzilla, who came out in 1954 and created an entire genre of giant monsters invading Tokyo. A few years later, Ultraman came along on television in the 1960s, and Ultraman was a silver giant whose job was to fight giant monsters. Ultraman became incredibly popular, spawned a genre called Tokatsu, and soon Japanese television was filled with Ultraman and Ultraman clones like Spectreman and Zone Fighter, all of whom were able to change shape into giants and fight giant monsters under various limitations. And eventually, that genre faded away, but then in the 1990s, we got the Power Rangers, which were basically English translations of a new Japanese set of cereal, giant monster cereals, the Super Sentai, or Rangers, or Kamen Rider. And this was a new line of series where teams of young people in skin-tight costumes would, fight earthly or alien menaces, which would invariably turn into giant monsters, which they would then combine to occupy a giant robot to defeat. So this is kind of a potted version of that history, and played for laughs. All right, so how much more time do you have? Okay. Well, slight change of pace then. I've got two stories that I can do. One is Romance of the Undead, which is a funny vampire story. Or I can read you an excerpt from a novel I've done called Axis of Andes. It's an alternate history novel about World War II in South America. And the passage that I've got features Adolf Hitler. So I'll let you choose. First one. Funny vampires it is. Rutger's coffin lay in its new resting place for 4 days before the vampire hunters discovered him. They were all waiting around the coffin as the sun vanished from the horizon. Rutger pulled himself from his casket, mouth fuzzy with that moldy smell that came from lying dead on top of your grave soil. He heard the whir of the camcorder. Baring his teeth, he looked from one to the other. They were all there, Brain, Leroy, Contessa, Ehor, and the others, dressed in black with their sepulchral pancake makeup. Look, can't you leave me with at least a little bit of dignity? Why are you here? Don't you people have lives? He snarled. So what'll you be doing tonight? Ehor asked. They were immune to insult, Ehor particularly. He was fat and ungainly with Coke bottle glasses and an appalling command of trivia. I hunt, Ehor, Rutger said simply. Hey, can that thing record me? He indicated the camcorder. Actually, Brain said, all we get is a blur, but it's a neat effect. Can we come with you? Leroy asked, licking his lips. We'd like to watch. Leroy had a straggly mustache, but otherwise was nondescript. He needed to bathe more often. Rutger thought Leroy is the pest most likely to become a serial killer. No, he told him. I should kill them all, he thought, not for the first time. I should have killed them the first time I noticed them skulking around. But it had been too late even then, he thought sourly. It had all been recorded and referenced. There were detailed descriptions of him and his activities in sealed envelopes and hidden places, all ready to reach interested parties should any of them disappear. They'd made that clear in those first encounters. Not that they were threatening him, they'd hasten to add. Oh no, they were big fans of his, or of what he was. They'd seen all the movies, they'd read all the books, they even tried to dress the part. Actually, Bella said, we'd like you to come to my place. We're going to hold a special ceremony. Bella was small and weaselly. Rutger was sure Bella was not his real name. Rather, he chose to model himself after his favorite character. To Rutger, he looked more like a Renfield. Yeah, about your clothes, Ehor was saying as they tagged along after him. Oh, God, not that again. What? It was no use trying to ditch them. They'd shown a disquieting ability to find him wherever he hid. He could, he supposed, outdistance them, but you can't feed a dead run. There's nothing to do but hope they go away. Well, why don't you dress better, like in the movies, Ehor asked. Yeah, Leroy put in. Cool threads, bitchy leather jacket, maybe some hot cowboy boots. No, I need something classy, like a tailored suit or a tux. Perhaps with an opera cape, Rutger thought. No, thanks. He didn't want people noticing him because he was well dressed. He preferred something plain and unassuming. Blue jeans, bomber jacket, that worked nicely. Jet black, the Contessa said huskily, like the night. Yeah, like your lipstick, Rutger bit back. The Contessa was the tallest of the group, etching out Brain by a good inch. As far as he could tell, her entire wardrobe was black. All her tops and dresses were low cut, and she didn't seem to own a bra. She cultivated a superior reserve, but wasn't that different from the rest of them. Hey, can you transform into a wolf? Brain asked. Yes. What about a Rottweiler? A what? It's a kind of dog. I don't do dogs, Rutger said brusquely. It had been such a mistake to let them coax him into the archer's transformation into a bat. What about a goat? I don't know, he said irritably. A giraffe? Ehor asked. Rutger stopped and stared at him. An animal that's bigger than you were. Rutger looked at him coolly and then continued to walk. Can you transform into any animal, Brain was asking, or are you restricted to predators? Rutger stopped again and faced them all. Look, he said, stop following me. I have to hunt. If we leave you alone, will you come to our ceremony? Bella quavered. This is what I'm reduced to, Rutger thought, bargaining with imbeciles. All right, he said grudgingly. Bella grinned. 11:30, my place, apartment 1313, 664, the Rice Building. Yeah, I'll be there. Do not feed too deeply, the Contessa whispered. There will be refreshments. He turned his back and stalked off, listening for footsteps after him. They were gone. How did they keep finding him, he wondered. Perhaps they'd hidden one of those radio transmitter tags on his person or coffin like they did on Wild Kingdom. He found the idea profoundly disquieting. Hunting was lousy. Hunting had been lousy since they'd started following around. Once again, he contemplated pulling up stakes, moving to another city. Around 10:30, he found a victim, man walking back from the convenience store. It was usually best to disguise these things as mugging. Rutger raced up behind the man, clouting him under his left ear as he turned. The blow opened a small wound. Rutger pulled a limp form behind a dumpster, spent 5 minutes licking blood from the wound before a passing car drove him away. As he flitted down shadowed back alleys, Rutger checked the man's wallet. Only $14. He almost threw it away. Enter freely and of your own will, Bella told him. Had he gotten that from some book, Rutger wondered. Oh, shove it, Rutger said as he shouldered past. I'm so glad you came, Bella gushed. Rutger walked into the modest one-bedroom apartment. They were all there, the whole damn gang of them. The walls were lined with bookcases above which were movie posters. Couple is Dracula, Langella's Dracula, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Abbott and Costello meet Dracula ad infinitum ad nauseum. Next to the television, there was a thick stack of DVDs. Rutger hardly needed to guess. They went to the bedroom. It wasn't much better. I've got such things to show you, Bella was saying. You wouldn't believe some of the things I've collected. Yeah, what, a rare first edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula? Rutger sneered. Or yeah, maybe an autographed Anne Rice paperback? Bella's eyes got huge. Wow, you're good. The bathroom door opened. Rutger turned as the figure stepped into the bedroom. A little hors d'oeuvre, the Comtesse said. Yeah, we kind of had the impression hunting hadn't been going well lately, Brain explained. Shiny hair was the first thing he noticed. Massive peroxide locks, rigid from hairspray. The second thing was the immense and improbably buoyant breast, spilling out of a tight sequin dress, bursting at the seams. She had blunt features obscured by makeup. He decided she'd never be beautiful, but in the right light, she could have been pretty. Rutger Van Helsing, Eeyore introduced him. Halsey, Rutger corrected. Van Halsey, Eeyore amended. Rutger gave up. Let me introduce you to Crystal Bathory, who gives her blood for your riddle. Charmed, she said, holding her hand up, knuckles slightly arched. Did she expect him to kiss it? He shook it gently. Actually, she simpered, that's my vampire name. My real name is Ruth Ann Simpson. Vampire name, Rutger wondered. What was he supposed to say to something like that? I'll drink your blood, he mumbled. She almost swooned. I'll be yours, she moaned. Rutger stepped towards her, uncomfortable in the circle of gawkers. Feeding should be a private thing, he thought, most of the time, even as victims were unconscious. Wait, she said, I have to take off my clothes first. What? He asked, looking around. Leroy stepped forward as he helped Crystal, or whatever her name was, struggle out of her dress. Oh, she wants to be sky-clad for it. This will be her first time. Crystal's been bitten by a vampire. She wants the ritual to be perfect. Ritual? Very well, he replied. Naked, Crystal proved to be a slightly fleshy girl with a large, muscular rump. He noted that her patch of pubic hair was an entirely different shade. Is this supposed to rouse me, he wondered? Stretch marks on the hips, skin blemishes, fugitive body hair standing black and defiant, dimpled knees, the smell of deodorants and shampoos, and under that armpit scents and a fast, nervous sweat. Oh, well, he'd have worse, he decided. The trick was not to dwell on these things when feeding. I have a poem I'd like to read first, she said. She cleared her throat, closed her eyes, and began to recite. Oh my God, he thought, kill me now. Still, the poem with its infantile symbolism and fractured meter was mercifully short. She crawled to the center of the bed and assumed a half-supine pose. I'm ready to surrender myself to the kiss of darkness, she quavered. It was lucky, he decided, that vampires didn't blush. Still, he found himself lowering his head and scratching at his hairline. They were all gathered around the bed, waiting expectantly. Oh, very well, he said. He climbed onto the bed, clambering until he was next to her. Standing on his knees, he towered over her as she batted cow eyes at him. What did they expect, he wondered. Experimentally, he bared his fangs and grasped her shoulders. She gasped. His hands, like ice from the grave, seized me in bronze of iron. He bent over her. She threw back her head, exposing her neck artery pulsing. Oh, no way, he thought. In movies, they always went for the neck. In real life, that was disastrous. For one thing, it's hard to leave a more obvious mark. And for another, there's always the danger of crushing the esophagus, inflicting an inadvertent whiplash, or worst of all, hitting the artery. You could lose a good shirt hitting the artery. Necks were bad. They were messy, obvious, and all too often, ultimately fatal for all involved. He usually preferred to make a scratch in some less obvious area and suck away slowly. Scalp wounds were good. They bled like the dickens. Mind you, torsos weren't bad, nor were arms and legs. Someone coughed, urging him to get on with it. Where to bite? They'd probably want him to sink right in like the movies. It wasn't an especially efficient way to draw blood. He much preferred a superficial incision with one fang. Oh, they probably wanted to use both fangs. Well, why not just tattoo vampire over the mark, he thought sarcastically. But he held his tongue. There was no point in giving them ideas. He eyed her form doubtfully. He hated it when his fangs scraped bones. The breast looked safest. Gingerly, he bit down. She arched her back and let out a deep sigh. Give me a break, he thought, rolling his eyes. Teeth penetrate my flesh. There's a sharp stabbing sensation fading to a warm ache. Cold shivers run up and down my spine. My nipples harden, and I feel an electric tingling in the pit of my stomach. Oh, please shut up, he thought. His jaw worked slowly as he began to suck. I am sustenance for the beast at my breast. How can I describe the sensation as my being passes remorselessly into him? Abruptly, his mouth filled with a strange viscous liquid. Gagging and panic, he detached from her, staggering off the bed, bent over. He hacked and coughed, expelling what seemed like a thick, translucent medium. What? He snarled, gasping. What the hell was that? From the bed, she screamed in genuine terror. Oh my God, he bit my implant. I'm leaking. I'm leaking. He looked back. She was screaming and writhing around on the bed as Brain and Eeyore attempted to comfort her. As she clutched her breast, he could see more clear, thick fluid oozing out like transparent toothpaste. These things cause cancer, she screamed. It's okay, Bella yelled back at her. I've got a repair kit in my bicycle. We can just patch it for you. Get me to a hospital. Stop squeezing it like that, Brain cautioned. You're forcing it out. As he watched amazed, he realized, yes, her breasts were now noticeably lopsided. The humans thrashed about in the bed as it became increasingly slippery with blood and silicon. The rising level of panic engulfed them all. He realized suddenly, none of them were paying attention to him. As quietly as he could, he turned around and walked out of the room. Bella rushed past him into the living room to grapple with the lock on his bicycle's emergency kit, blocking the doorway. Casually, Rutger stepped backwards through sliding glass doors onto the balcony. The cold night air greeted him like a friend. He could scurry down the side of the building, be gone an hour before they noticed. What fools these mortals be, a husky voice murmured. He jumped. The Contessa stood there leaning against the wall of the balcony, smoking a cigarette from a long holder. She wore white evening gloves that came halfway up her arms and her usual low-cut black gown. They looked at each other. I just came out here to get away from the confusion, he told her. Oh, I'm sure you weren't impressed with that childish display any more than I am, she said. Puerile acting out of adolescent fantasies. He suspected that she knew a lot more about puerile adolescent fantasies than she would have admitted. He remained silent. They're so hopeless, she said. I don't know why I even hang out with them. Contessa, queen of the nerds, she laughed. Still, she intoned, they brought us together. Well, he said carefully. Oh, here it comes, he thought sourly. Take me, she said, baring her breast. Make me one with you. Initiate me into the mysteries of darkness. Make me a vampire so that we may hunt the eternal night forever. Seduce me. I could just push her over the balcony, he thought desperately. Could pass for a regular accident. But he realized it wouldn't work. The others inside would know, and sooner or later he'd be destroyed. Look, I can't make you a vampire. It doesn't work that way, he said desperately. And you've got it all wrong. This is not a romantic existence. Listen, he tried to explain to her. I don't seduce my victims. They're just food. I don't have relationships with them any more than you have relationships with Big Mac. I mean, who wants to have a deep spiritual dialogue with Thanksgiving turkey? You eat it, that's all. You don't take it home. You don't make friends with it. I don't relate to my victims. I don't talk to them. I don't even like talking to people. But you can't deny the intimacy of the event, she persisted. What intimacy? He asked. Who do you think my victims are? Actresses and models, beautiful, talented people? Why? What for? Blood is blood. I don't want to take risks. I don't need an emotional experience. I just have to eat. I look for the safest, easiest, fastest prey. Old people, drunks, the sick. I spend a lot of time in skid rows and hospitals preying on people who are too out of it to notice or in such bad shape that other people won't spot a mark. I mug people. I have to go out of my way to disguise my bite as a blemish, the remains of a sore, an infection, a scratch, or a scrape. Do you have any idea how many knees I've sucked? The elbows, the noses? There's nothing romantic about sucking a nose. There's no society of vampires. We're like tigers. We require our own territory. We don't even like each other. We're solitary parasites. We hunt. That's all. The loneliness of the tiger burning bright, she whispered. We're the same spirit, you and I. Let me ease your immortality. Had she listened to a word he'd said, he was appalled. Inside, the level of chaos continued to rise as the rapidly deflating crystal used a fire extinguisher to defend herself from her rescuer. The Contessa's breasts were still bared. Oh, well, he thought, if you can't beat them. He bent over her as she shivered at his touch. The racket inside was reaching new proportions. He rolled his eyes. Creatures of the night, he whispered. What music they make. Voila. It was supposed to be funny. And that's being published a couple of years ago in a goth magazine in Toronto. And I'm actually thinking of using that as the framework for a short novel. It'll be a Scarface type thing. And the idea is that eventually they break him down, seduce him into playing along. He discovers it's actually a pretty good lifestyle. New clothes, new cars, it's Scarface. And he gets used to it until they turn on him. So I think that'll be my project for this summer. So how much more time do you have? Pardon?
7 minutes.
7 minutes. It's a short one. It's about 7 or 8 minutes. Or we could just talk. I mean, whatever you'd like. Pardon? Okay. Hitler didn't stand. Instead, he genially waved the South American visitors to take a seat. The Minister Velasco and the Colonel Alba gingerly took their chairs. The rest of the German cabinet resumed their positions, watching the Fuhrer warily. I regret, Hitler began, that the press of European matters, particularly the struggle of our brother, Commander Franco, doesn't allow us much time. But be welcome. Tell us of matters in South America. Thank you, Great Fuhrer, Velasco began. Ecuador is a proud country with an honorable history like Germany itself, but like Germany, threatened by a great many whose designs would drive our noble people into the sea. You speak of Peru, of course, Hitler said, checking his notes. The fabled land of the Incas. Velasco paused, trying to think of how to respond to this. Yeah, it said the Inca began in the lands of Ecuador, though. Over time, their conquest extended the length of the Andes. Indeed, Hitler asked, with every sign of earnest fascination. How marvelous! The Inca folk were a remarkable race, superior to the lowly Indians in every way. I hear they left remarkable ruins behind, strange cities and pyramids. And they began in Ecuador, you say? Yes, they did, Velasco said. The Indians of Peru, the Indians still make up the majority of Peru, were their slaves, and when the Inca fell, they were no match for the Spanish. The monuments of the true Inca, though, are found throughout Ecuador. Quite remarkable. I would like to see that myself sometime. How's the climate there? Moderate, Velasco replied. European in nature, very much like Berlin. Really, Hitler replied. Why doesn't Ecuador rest on the equator? I think it would be a tropical bath. It would be, but we're sheltered by the mountains and the cold ocean currents. Ecuador has the most European climate in South America. Particularly because of that, we've been blessed with a greater immigration of the white races, particularly Germans. Is that so, Hitler beamed. He turned to Canaris. Is that true, Herr Canaris? Is there a little piece of the German nation straddling the equator? There are many Germans in South America, Canaris answered, particularly in Argentina and Chile, but in Ecuador as well. I think the largest German communities are in Chile. Well, I should wonder then, Hitler said, why the Chileans are not here as well. Don't we have connections there? Many of the Chilean Germans are Jews or communists, Velasco said lightly. A light film of sweat appearing in his forehead. I mean, not all by any means, but many. Hitler looked at Caneros, who shrugged. What of Peru? Indians and Bolsheviks, Velasco replied quickly, and Jews. Well, Hitler said, that stands to reason. Where you find Bolsheviks, you also find Jews, and the reverse. It's just like in Russia. The Indians are like the Slavs, a slave race too easily led. A simple childlike race of savages, as Karl May shows us, without the wisdom to see through the lies of communism. Velasco opened his mouth and closed it. Abruptly, Hitler's manner changed and became blunt and businesslike. What is it you want from us? Velasco nodded to Colonel Alba and began to stand up. Hitler raised an eyebrow. Alba sat down. He cleared his throat. We're a small but valiant nation preparing to defend ourselves from a powerful enemy. Already that enemy has made war upon our neighbor. Now it seeks to claim our territory or Lebensraum, Hitler offered. Yeah, living space. Steal land from European people. Fill it with Slavs and Bolsheviks. Yeah. Alba blinked and then had the wisdom to nod twice. Yes, exactly. They have numbers and powerful supporters. We need assistance. Yeah, what sort of assistance? Weapons, Alba said, and munitions, artillery, armor, aircraft, radio, perhaps trainers, whatever you can spare, even trucks. And you assume we have vast quantities to spare to give you. You assume we're not confronted by true Bolsheviks, far more insidious and ruthless than the schemers you face. You feel that we're not troubled by Slavs in endless numbers, Poles and Russians, that we're not ringed by enemies led by these self-same Jews. The German people have not been forced to the precipice, standing alone in a sea of mongrel races, betrayed from within and without. The Aryan people must stand together, Velasco said, no matter where they are against the rising red tide. And you have come to the aid of Spain. Ah, so you see us coming to the aid of our friend, Commander Franco, Hitler said. And you think to yourselves, these are just the chaps to save us from the horde of Indians and Bolsheviks. Yeah, what of your friends to the north, the Americans? Unfortunately, their business interests are substantially greater in Peru than in Ecuador, and so they favor enemies. Oh, and behind business interests are the Jews, Hitler said knowingly. You see how it all comes together? We've often thought so, Velasco agreed. Abruptly, Hitler's manner changed again. We will consider your request, he said. There are many demands on our resources, but maybe we can find something to spare for you. Now, thank you for your time. You must excuse us, we have a long agenda. Solemnly, Hitler stood as Velasco and Alba came forward to shake hands. They exchanged greetings with the rest of Hitler's cabinet and were escorted from the room. Yeah, one more thing, Hitler called. The Ecuadorian stopped. Your president, Napoleon Boniface, he said. Yes, Velasco replied carefully. Is he by any chance related to the famous French general? Colonel Alba cleared his throat, but Velasco spoke first. Well, he's never spoken of it, but many French and Germans came to Ecuador after the Battle of Waterloo, finding Europe no longer sympathetic to them. So it's certainly likely. Ah, Hitler said. Interesting. Thank you. You may go. He watched as the two men left, and once they were safely out of earshot. What an extraordinary thing, he ejaculated, suddenly barking a few short laughs. I've never imagined such a thing. Why, they were right out of a comic opera. There was a round of sycophantic laughter. Did you see the colonel? Goebbels chuckled. I was nearly beside myself with all his gold braid and epaulets. I was almost ready to ask him to carry my luggage. Yes, Goring laughed. I was almost certain Canaris had hired a couple of actors to play a prank on us. Imagine that, Hitler said. A lost country of Aryans on the equator amid the ruins of pyramids and temples, facing hordes of Indians and Bolsheviks. Why, it's out of Karl May. No, it's even more bizarre than even May would write. You should send them to Benito, Himmler said. I'm sure he'd love them. Actually, Canaris said, they've already met Mussolini, who indicated he was quite receptive. Has he made a commitment? Not yet. Oh, of course he'd be receptive, Hitler said thoughtfully. Our friend Benito's hungry for overseas colonies. I'm sure he'd love an opportunity to carve himself a slice of Europe, of South America in some fashion. But make no mistake, things will be decided here. We shouldn't get involved in a sideshow. I don't see any merit getting involved, Himmler said. Let the South Americans deal with their own matters. Hitler shrugged, steepling his fingers. What do you say, Herman? He asked Goering. Like Heinrich Goring replied, I see no advantage, as you say, being diverted by a sideshow. And to play too heavily might antagonize the Americans. Hitler shrugged at the mention of the Americans. True, but they've come all this way and our enemies are their enemies. I wouldn't want to see Bolshevism defeated here only to have the Jews establish a new fortress somewhere else. He shook himself, seeming to make a decision. The great battle is coming, even Spain is merely a sideshow. Still, if beggars come to our table, it's only polite to throw them a few crumbs. Let's see if we can spare them a few Deutschmarks and rifles. It might do some good. I'm sure our friend Benita will chip in, and Heinrich, send a letter to our friend Henry Ford, ask him to help out. After all, this is America's domain. We should encourage Americans to choose the right party, not antagonize them. Help them, but not too much help. We're here to win victories, gentlemen, not enemies. Hitler watched for a second as the secretary transcribed notes. All right, now, next item on the agenda. And out of that meeting, a few years later, 1.5 million people are dead, a continent is in flame, and 5 countries cease to exist. So that was also kind of played for laughs, but for dark laughs. You can tell that Hitler and his crew, they're out of their fucking minds, obviously. And they're not taking the South Americans very seriously. And so you've got these 2 groups of people who are there just trying to manage each other. And the South Americans are desperate, so they're putting up with any kind of nonsense from Hitler. And he's not taking any of it seriously. But it starts the ball rolling. This is one of my books, The Mermaid's Tale. I do a bunch of ebooks. Bear Cavalry, which is an alternate history novel about bear cavalry. No Wars in Dark Places, What Devours